Some wounds never heal, especially those inflicted by the people who should love us most. In the small frontier town of Cedar Ridge, 38-year-old Maybelle Wallace knew this truth better than anyone. Her father, Sheriff Clay Wallace, stood on the courthouse steps that hot afternoon, calling out to the crowd like a man selling livestock. "Who wants my fat daughter?" He laughed, bundling her hand in marriage with worthless land parcels to settle his debts. Maybelle stood there in silence, carrying years of shame and sorrow. Then a quiet mountain man named Jack Brennan stepped forward from the crowd. "I'll take her and the land," he said simply. Those 7 words would change everything. But would this cold bargain become something beautiful, or would Maybelle stay trapped forever? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The memory always came back in fragments, her mother's voice singing softly, then the silence that followed, stretching into 38 years of emptiness. Maybelle Wallace kept her mother's wedding ring hidden beneath loose floorboards in her tiny bedroom, wrapped in faded calico that still held the ghost of lavender water. She would hold it sometimes in the dark hours before dawn, wondering what love felt like when it wasn't measured by the weight of disappointment. Cedar Ridge clung to existence like a tick on a dying dog, Sheriff Clay Wallace often said, though he never mentioned that he was doing most of the bleeding. The town had sprouted around a trading post 20 years back when trappers and settlers thought the creek might lead somewhere profitable. Now, with the railroad pushing west and threatening to bypass them entirely, most folks were either leaving or digging in their heels with the stubbornness of people who had nowhere else to go. Maybelle had never been anywhere else. Born in the back room of what was now Patterson's General Store, she'd spent her entire life within walking distance of that courthouse where her father conducted his daily theater of authority. Every morning, he'd pin on that tarnished badge like he was armoring himself for battle, though the only real conflicts in Cedar Ridge came from drunks, claim jumpers, and his own gambling debts. "You killed your mother coming into this world," he'd told her on her 16th birthday. The same words he'd used every year since she was old enough to understand them. "Least you could do is make yourself useful." Useful meant cooking his meals, mending his clothes, and staying invisible when his poker friends came by. Useful meant never asking for anything, never expecting anything, never taking up more space than absolutely necessary. The townspeople had grown accustomed to seeing her hurry through her errands with her head down, a large woman trying to make herself small, purchasing supplies with careful arithmetic that stretched every coin. Dr. Morrison had delivered her into the world and watched her mother bleed to death despite his efforts. He'd been the only person in 38 years to look at Maybelle with something approaching kindness, though even he maintained a careful distance. "Your mother was a fine woman," he'd told her once when she was 12 and had asked about the woman in the faded tintype. "She would have loved you something fierce." Mrs. Patterson, who ran the general store with the efficiency of a woman who'd raised 6 children and buried 2, treated Maybelle with brisk courtesy. She never lingered over transactions or asked personal questions, but she also never shortchanged her or made her wait while serving other customers. It was a small kindness in a life that had known very few. The exception was young Tommy Fletcher, barely 14, and full of the kind of earnest enthusiasm that hadn't yet been beaten down by hard living. He worked odd jobs around town and always tipped his hat to Maybelle when their paths crossed. "Afternoon, Miss Wallace," he'd say with genuine warmth, and for a moment she could almost imagine what it might feel like to be seen as something other than Clay Wallace's disappointing daughter. Cedar Ridge itself reflected the sheriff's gradual decay. Paint peeled from storefronts, boardwalks sagged under the weight of too many harsh winters, and the church bell hadn't rung properly since a storm 2 years back knocked the tower askew. The railroad surveyors had come through the previous autumn, taking measurements and making notes, but their promises felt as thin as morning mist. Sheriff Wallace's gambling had started as entertainment and evolved into desperation. Poker games that once ended with friendly handshakes now stretched until dawn, with IOUs replacing actual money and tempers growing shorter with each losing hand. The land parcels he'd acquired through foreclosures and questionable legal maneuvering were scattered through the hills like a deck of cards, thrown by an angry child, worthless pieces of rock and scrub that nobody wanted, nobody except Jack Brennan. Most folks in Cedar Ridge had heard stories about the mountain man who lived somewhere up in the high country, trading pelts for supplies a few times each year and keeping to himself otherwise. He was a figure of speculation and occasional fear, a man who'd chosen solitude so completely that his rare appearances in town felt like visitations from another world. Maybelle had seen him perhaps half a dozen times over the years, always at a distance, tall and lean, with graying brown hair and eyes the color of winter sky. He moved through the world with the quiet confidence of someone who needed nothing from it. He paid in gold coins that rang true on the counter, bought his supplies without conversation, and disappeared back into the mountains before anyone could ask questions. The stories about him varied, depending on who was telling them. Some said he'd been a soldier who'd seen too much killing and chose peace. Others claimed he'd lost a family to disease or violence and couldn't bear the company of others. A few whispered darker tales about crimes or madness, but those usually came from men who'd never been further from town than their own front porches. What everyone agreed on was that Jack Brennan was not a man to be trifled with. He carried himself with the alert stillness of someone accustomed to danger, and the few times anyone had tried to cheat or intimidate him, they'd found themselves facing a quiet resolve that was somehow more unsettling than any display of anger. The morning of the auction, Cedar Ridge hummed with the kind of nervous energy that preceded either celebration or catastrophe. Word had spread that Sheriff Wallace was finally calling in his debts, and half the town was curious to see what kind of desperate measures a desperate man might take. The other half stayed away, wanting no part of whatever ugliness was about to unfold. Maybelle had known this day was coming. She'd heard the arguments behind closed doors, seen the way her father's eyes had grown increasingly wild as his creditors circled closer. When he told her that morning to wear her one good dress and meet him at the courthouse, she'd understood without explanation what was expected of her. The dress was brown wool, practical and shapeless, purchased 5 years ago for a funeral and worn only for occasions that required respectability. It hung on her like a judgment, neither flattering nor particularly modest, simply present. She'd pinned her dark hair back with the same care she used for everything else, enough effort to avoid criticism, not enough to suggest vanity. Standing on those courthouse steps while her father called for bidders, Maybelle felt the familiar numbness that had carried her through every other humiliation. This was simply the logical conclusion of a life that had never belonged to her anyway. She was 38 years old, unmarried, and too large for the conventional standards of feminine appeal. In her father's calculation, she was worth exactly what someone might pay for worthless land, which was to say, nothing at all. The crowd that gathered was smaller than she'd feared, but larger than she'd hoped. Curious townspeople mixed with a few genuine bidders interested in the land parcels, though most of the latter looked skeptical about what they might be getting. Sheriff Wallace held the papers in his hand like a man dealing cards, his voice carrying the forced joviality of someone trying to sell something he knew was worthless. "Fine parcels of land up in the hills," he called out, his words slurring slightly from the whiskey he'd been drinking since breakfast. "And for the right man, I'll throw in my daughter here as well. Package deal?" The laughter that followed was uncomfortable, the kind that comes when people don't know whether they're witnessing a joke or a tragedy. Maybelle kept her eyes on the horizon, where the mountains rose like promises of escape she would never be allowed to claim. That was when Jack Brennan stepped forward from the back of the crowd, his voice cutting through the nervous chatter like a blade through silk. "I'll take her and the land." The silence that followed seemed to stretch for hours, though it couldn't have lasted more than a few heartbeats. Sheriff Wallace's face went through several expressions: surprise, suspicion, and finally a calculating greed that Maybelle recognized all too well. "Well now," he said, his voice gaining strength as he sensed an actual transaction in the offing. "That's what I like to hear. A man who knows value when he sees it." Maybelle felt something shift inside her chest, a sensation she couldn't immediately identify. For the first time in her life, someone had claimed her not as a burden to be endured, but as something worth having. The feeling was so foreign that she almost mistook it for illness. Jack Brennan's words hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire, carrying implications that nobody quite knew how to handle. The mountain man stood perfectly still, while the crowd processed what they'd just witnessed, his weathered hands loose at his sides, his pale eyes fixed on Sheriff Wallace with an intensity that made several onlookers step back. "You serious about this?" Clay Wallace asked, his voice carrying a mix of hope and suspicion. He'd grown accustomed to disappointment over the years, especially when it came to his schemes for easy money. "Because I ain't got time for games." Jack reached into his coat and withdrew a leather pouch that clinked with the unmistakable sound of gold coins. "How much for the land and the woman?" The bluntness of the question sent a ripple through the assembled crowd. Mrs. Patterson made a small sound of disapproval, while Dr. Morrison removed his spectacles and cleaned them with unnecessary attention. Young Tommy Fletcher looked between Maybelle and Jack with the wide-eyed confusion of someone watching adults behave, in ways that defied his understanding of proper conduct. Sheriff Wallace's eyes fixed on the leather pouch with the hungry intensity of a man who'd been living on credit and desperate hope for months. His gambling debts had grown beyond his ability to manage, and his creditors were no longer accepting promises. The land parcels he was offering were indeed worthless, rocky, inaccessible plots in the high country that might be suitable for goats if someone was desperate enough to try ranching at that altitude. $300, he said, the number emerging from somewhere between greed and desperation. It was more money than most people in Cedar Ridge saw in 2 years, and everyone present knew it. Jack nodded once and began counting coins onto the courthouse steps. The gold pieces caught the afternoon sunlight and threw it back in warm, steady flashes that mesmerized the onlookers. Real money was rare enough in Cedar Ridge that many of the townspeople had never seen so much actual gold in one place. Maybelle watched the transaction with a growing sense of unreality. 38 years of existing as her father's unwanted burden, and now she was being purchased like livestock by a man she'd never spoken to. The practical part of her mind noted that Jack Brennan looked clean and healthy, that his clothes were well maintained if simple, and that he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to taking care of himself. The frightened part wondered what he expected from a woman who'd never been desired by anyone. "There's conditions," Jack said as he finished counting. "The marriage happens today, legal and proper. I want the deed to the land clear and clean. And once this is done, it's done. No coming back later with complaints or demands." Sheriff Wallace was already reaching for the money. Sure. "Whatever you want. Judge Harrison can do the ceremony right now if you're in a hurry." "I am." The judge, a thin man in his 60s who'd been hoping to avoid involvement in Clay Wallace's latest scheme, found himself pressed into service. He retrieved his worn copy of the legal codes from his office and returned to the courthouse steps with the reluctant air of someone performing an unpleasant duty. "You sure about this, Jack?" he asked quietly, apparently one of the few people in town who'd exchanged more than business pleasantries with the mountain man over the years. "Marriage ain't something to enter into lightly, I'm sure." Judge Harrison turned to Maybelle, his expression gentle but serious. "Miss Wallace, you understand what's happening here? You're agreeing to this marriage of your own free will?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Maybelle looked at her father, who was clutching the gold coins with white knuckles, then at the crowd of townspeople who were watching her with expressions ranging from pity to curiosity. Finally, she looked at Jack Brennan, who was studying her face with an attention that felt different from the way other people looked at her, not evaluating her worth or measuring her failures, but simply seeing her, "Yes," she said, her voice stronger than she'd expected. "I agree. The ceremony that followed was brief and functional, stripped of any pretense of romance or celebration." Judge Harrison read the necessary words in a voice that suggested he was getting through an unfortunate but legally required task. Sheriff Wallace signed the marriage certificate with a flourish that spoke of relief more than joy. Jack's signature was careful and precise, the handwriting of someone who'd learned to read and write as an adult and took the skill seriously. When it came time for Maybelle to sign, her hand trembled slightly as she wrote her name, Maybelle Brennan. The letters looked foreign on the page, like they belonged to someone else entirely. "Well," Judge Harrison said, closing his book with a snap, "I pronounce you husband and wife. May God have mercy on both your souls." It wasn't the most encouraging benediction Maybelle had ever heard, but it was legally binding. She was no longer Maybelle Wallace, unwanted daughter and burden. She was Maybelle Brennan, though what that meant remained to be seen. The crowd began to disperse with the awkward efficiency of people who'd witnessed something they weren't sure they should have seen. Mrs. Patterson approached with a brown paper package tied with string. "Some things for your new home," she said quietly, pressing the package into Maybelle's hands. "Basic supplies to get you started." Dr. Morrison tipped his hat. "If you need anything, Mrs. Brennan, don't hesitate to send word." The formal address, Mrs. Brennan, sent another shock through Maybelle's system. In the space of 10 minutes, she'd gone from being Clay Wallace's disappointing daughter to being Jack Brennan's wife. The transformation felt too sudden and too complete to be real. Sheriff Wallace had already disappeared, presumably to settle his debts while his luck held. He hadn't said goodbye to his daughter, hadn't offered any words of advice or even acknowledgement that her life had just changed forever. His relief at being rid of both his financial obligations and his unwanted child was so obvious that several townspeople looked uncomfortable on Maybelle's behalf. Jack watched the sheriff's departure with an expression that revealed nothing of his thoughts. When the last of the crowd had scattered, he turned to Maybelle with the same calm attention he'd shown throughout the entire proceedings. "You'll want to pack your things," he said. "We'll leave within the hour." "Leave?" The word came out sharper than she'd intended. "Today?" "No reason to wait. The cabin's a hard ride from here, and I'd rather make most of the journey in daylight." Maybelle looked back at the town that had been her entire world for 38 years. Cedar Ridge wasn't much, but it was familiar. The idea of leaving it behind for an unknown life with an unknown man was terrifying in ways she couldn't articulate. "How do I know?" she began, then stopped herself. How did she know he wouldn't hurt her? How did she know this wasn't some elaborate cruelty? How did she know anything about the man who'd just purchased her like a horse or a piece of farm equipment? Jack seemed to understand the unfinished question. "You don't," he said simply, "but you know what you're leaving behind. That ought to count for something." It did count for something. Whatever waited for her in the mountains couldn't be worse than the daily humiliation of life as Clay Wallace's unwanted daughter. At least this unknown future belonged to her in ways that her old life never had. "I'll need a few minutes to gather my things," she said. "Take what time you need." "I'll wait." Those last 3 words, "I'll wait," carried a weight that Maybelle didn't fully understand. No one had ever waited for her before. People had waited for her to finish tasks, to get out of the way, to stop being an inconvenience. But no one had ever simply waited for her, as if her comfort and readiness mattered. She walked back toward the small house behind the sheriff's office, where she'd spent her entire life, her mind reeling with the magnitude of what had just happened. In the space of an afternoon, everything had changed. She was married to a stranger, bound for a place she'd never seen, carrying a name that felt like borrowed clothes. The land deed tucked in Jack's coat pocket represented more than property. It was the foundation of whatever life they might build together, worthless though it might appear to others. Maybelle's possessions fit into a single canvas bag with room to spare. 38 years of living, and she could carry everything that truly belonged to her in one hand. The weight of it felt both pathetic and liberating. Pathetic because it spoke to how little she'd been allowed to accumulate. Liberating because it meant she could leave without looking back. Her mother's wedding ring went into the deepest corner of the bag, wrapped in the same faded calico that had protected it all these years. 3 worn dresses, 2 sets of undergarments, a pair of sturdy boots that had been resoled twice, and the handmade quilt that represented the only beautiful thing she'd ever created. The quilt had taken her 2 winters to complete, pieced together from scraps and remnants with patterns that came from somewhere deep in her memory, possibly her mother's influence. Though she had no way of knowing for certain, Jack waited beside a sturdy horse that looked as practical and well-maintained as its owner. The animal was a bay gelding with intelligent eyes and the kind of steady temperament that suggested careful training rather than natural docility. A pack horse stood nearby, already loaded with supplies that spoke of a man who planned ahead and wasted nothing. "You ride?" Jack asked as she approached with her bag. "Not really. Some when I was younger." She'd ridden Dr. Morrison's old mare a few times as a child, before her father decided that such activities were unsuitable for a girl who needed to learn her place in the world. Jack nodded and adjusted the stirrups on a smaller saddle that hadn't been there when she'd gone to pack. "This belonged to the previous owner. Should fit you well enough." The consideration implicit in his preparation, that he'd thought ahead to her needs, had anticipated the practicalities of traveling with a woman who might not be an experienced rider, surprised her. It suggested a level of forethought that went beyond the immediate transaction they'd just completed. The journey out of Cedar Ridge took them through terrain that Maybelle had seen only from a distance. The foothills rolled away from the town like waves frozen in brown and green, gradually gaining height as they moved toward the mountains proper. Jack set a steady pace that was challenging without being punishing, occasionally glancing back to check on her progress, but never making her feel like a burden. The silence between them was different from the oppressive quiet of her father's house. This felt expectant rather than hostile, as if they were both taking time to adjust to the reality of what they'd committed themselves to. Maybelle found herself studying Jack's posture in the saddle, the easy way he moved with his horse, the alert but relaxed attention he paid to their surroundings. "How long have you lived up here?" she asked after they'd been riding for over an hour. 7 years, give or take. "You built the cabin yourself?" "Mostly. Had some help with the roof raising." The conversation felt careful. Each question and answer weighted with the awareness that they were strangers, trying to find their way toward something that might resemble familiarity. Maybelle wanted to ask more, where he'd come from, what had driven him to choose such isolation, whether he regretted the decision he'd made that afternoon. But the questions felt too large for their current tentative understanding. The landscape changed as they climbed, becoming wilder and more dramatic. Pine trees appeared in increasing numbers, their scent sharp and clean in the thin air. Rock outcroppings jutted from the hillsides like the bones of sleeping giants, and the path they followed seemed to know secrets that only long experience could teach. "It's beautiful," Maybelle said, and meant it. She'd lived her entire life in the shadow of these mountains without ever truly seeing them. From Cedar Ridge, there'd been a distant backdrop, impressive but remote. Here, surrounded by their immediate presence, she felt something she couldn't quite name. Not peace, exactly, but a sense of space and possibility that her cramped life in town had never allowed. "Gets more so as you go higher," Jack said. "Country up there that most folks never see." As the afternoon progressed, Maybelle began to understand why Jack had been confident about making the journey in daylight. He knew this terrain with the intimacy of someone who'd traveled it countless times, reading signs in the landscape that were invisible to her untrained eye. When they stopped to rest the horses, he pointed out landmarks and natural features, with the casual expertise of a man who'd made the mountains, his home in ways that went deeper than simple residence. "Creek runs year-round through that draw," he said, indicating a fold in the hills that looked unremarkable to her. "Good water even in dry years." Deer come down to drink at dawn and dusk. The knowledge was practical rather than poetic, but something in the way he shared it suggested a deep appreciation for the land that went beyond mere utility. This was a man who'd found something in the wilderness that he couldn't find among people, and Maybelle found herself curious about what that might be. The cabin appeared as they crested a rise, just as the sun was beginning to sink toward the western peaks. It sat in a natural clearing surrounded by tall pines, positioned to take advantage of morning sunlight and afternoon shade. The structure was larger than she'd expected, not grand but substantial, built with the careful attention to detail that marked a craftsman who took pride in his work. "Home," Jack said simply, and there was something in his voice that spoke of genuine attachment to the place. Maybelle dismounted, with legs that were sorer than she'd expected, and stood looking at what was now, presumably her home as well. The cabin was built of logs that had been carefully chinked and sealed, with a stone chimney that rose straight and true from the center of the roof. A covered porch ran across the front, furnished with 2 chairs that looked hand-built but comfortable. Windows flanked the front door, their glass reflecting the last light of the day. "It's very nice," she said, and realized she meant it. The cabin had a solidity and permanence that her father's house had always lacked, as if it had been built by someone who intended to stay, rather than someone marking time, until something better came along. Jack began unloading the pack horse with efficient movements that spoke of long practice. "Stables around back for the horses. Wells over there by the big pine. Privies behind that stand of aspen." He was giving her the orientation that any new resident would need. But Maybelle heard something else in his voice, a barely perceptible nervousness that suggested he was as uncertain about this new arrangement as she was. The realization was oddly comforting. Whatever this was going to be, at least they were both stepping into unknown territory. "Can I help with anything?" she asked. Jack paused in his unloading and looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "If you want. Horses need tending before we get settled." The simple acceptance of her offer felt like a small victory. She followed him to the stable, which proved to be as well built and thoughtfully arranged as the cabin itself. As they worked together in the gathering dusk, unsaddling horses, checking hooves, measuring feed, Maybelle began to sense something of the rhythm that governed life in this place. It was a rhythm built around necessity and season, around the practical demands of survival in country that was beautiful but unforgiving. There was something deeply appealing about the clarity of it, the way each task connected directly to their well-being and comfort. The interior of the cabin surprised Maybelle even more than its exterior had. She'd expected the Spartan quarters of a man living alone, functional but bare, clean but cheerless. Instead, she found a space that spoke of someone who took genuine pleasure in his surroundings. Hand-hewn furniture showed the careful attention of a craftsman who worked wood because he enjoyed it, not merely because he needed chairs and tables. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth blackened by years of use, but swept clean. Most surprising of all was the bookshelf that occupied the entire wall opposite the fireplace, filled with volumes that ranged from practical guides to works of literature. "You read?" she said, not quite making it a question. Jack was lighting an oil lamp against the gathering darkness. "Learned when I was 25. Figured it was about time." The casual way he mentioned learning to read as an adult spoke to a kind of determined self-improvement that Maybelle found admirable. Most people who'd missed that education in childhood never bothered to acquire it later, accepting illiteracy as a permanent limitation. Jack had apparently refused to accept such boundaries. "What do you like to read?" He gestured toward the shelves. "Bit of everything. History mostly. Some poetry when the mood strikes. Shakespeare when the winter gets long enough." The image of this solitary mountain man reading Shakespeare by lamplight was so unexpected that Maybelle almost smiled. Almost. She'd forgotten how to smile naturally years ago, though something about this place and this man was stirring memories of what that felt like. "There's a room for you," Jack said, indicating a doorway she hadn't noticed. Used to be storage, but I cleared it out. Figured you'd want your privacy, the consideration implicit in that arrangement that he'd anticipated. Her need for personal space and had prepared, accordingly, was another surprise in what was becoming a day full of them. She peered into the small room and found a simple bed with clean linens, a washstand with a mirror and pegs on the wall for hanging clothes. It wasn't large, but it was more private space than she'd ever had in her father's house. "Thank you," she said, meaning it more deeply than the simple phrase could convey. Jack busied himself building up the fire while Maybelle explored her new surroundings. The cabin was clearly the work of someone who planned to live in it for years rather than seasons. Every detail showed thought and care. The way the windows were positioned to catch morning light, the efficiency of the kitchen area, the careful storage solutions that maximize space without creating clutter. "You hungry?" he asked when the fire was crackling steadily. She realized she was. The stress and strangeness of the day had suppressed her appetite. But now, in the warmth and relative security of the cabin, her body was remembering its basic needs. "I can cook," she offered. Jack paused in his movement toward the kitchen area. "Don't expect you to earn your keep if that's what you're thinking." The gentle firmness in his voice surprised her. She'd spent so many years being made to feel like a burden that the offer to contribute had been automatic, a defensive response born of long habit. "I like to cook," she said, which was true. It was one of the few activities that had brought her genuine satisfaction in her father's house. "If you don't mind." He studied her face for a moment, perhaps trying to determine whether she was offering from genuine desire or from the kind of ingrained obligation that women in her position often felt. "Kitchen's yours, then. I'll tend to a few things outside." He left her alone to explore the cooking arrangements, and Maybelle found herself impressed once again by the thoughtfulness of the setup. The stove was well maintained and properly vented. The pantry was stocked with basics that spoke of a man who planned his provisioning carefully. Flour, beans, salt pork, dried fruits, coffee, the foundations of solid frontier cooking. She found ingredients for a simple but substantial meal and set to work with the kind of focused attention that cooking had always demanded of her. There was something deeply satisfying about the familiar rituals, measuring flour, cutting vegetables, seasoning meat, that helped ground her in the reality of her changed circumstances. Jack returned as she was putting the finishing touches on the meal, carrying with him a small wooden box that he set carefully on the table. "Brought these down from the high country last month," he said, opening the box to reveal rows of what looked like small, dark berries. "Huckleberries. Thought you might like to try them." The gesture was small but thoughtful, and it suggested a level of consideration for her preferences that was entirely new in Maybelle's experience. She tasted one of the berries and found it tart and sweet, with a flavor that seemed to capture something essential about the mountain wilderness. "They're wonderful," she said. They ate in comfortable silence, each apparently lost in their own thoughts about the day's events and what they might mean for the future. The meal was simple but well prepared, and Maybelle found herself taking genuine pleasure in Jack's obvious appreciation for the food. "You cook better than anyone in Cedar Ridge," he said when they'd finished. "Mrs. Patterson makes excellent bread." "Mrs. Patterson's bread tastes like she resents every minute she spends making it. This tastes like you enjoyed the work." It was such an accurate observation that Maybelle looked at him with new interest. Most people ate what was put in front of them without much thought about the cook's state of mind. Jack had apparently learned to read subtleties that escaped others. "I did enjoy it," she admitted. "It's been a long time since I cooked for someone who seemed to appreciate it." After they'd cleaned up, Jack took a piece of wood from a box beside his chair and began working it with a small, sharp knife. The movements were precise and patient, each small cut deliberate and considered. Maybelle watched from her seat by the fire, fascinated by the care he brought to what was obviously a long-time habit. "What are you making?" "Nothing particular. Just keeping my hands busy." But there was something particular about the way he worked the wood, a kind of meditative attention that spoke of finding peace in the simple act of creating something useful or beautiful from raw material. The knife moved with the confidence of long practice, revealing the shape hidden within the wood through careful, patient removal of everything that didn't belong. "You whittle often?" "Most evenings. Helps me think." Maybelle found herself wondering what he thought about during these quiet sessions with wood and blade. The day's events? Plans for tomorrow? The strange woman he'd brought into his carefully ordered life? "You're safe here," he said suddenly, his eyes still fixed on his work. The words hung in the air between them, simple and direct and utterly unexpected. Maybelle felt something tight in her. Chest began to loosen, a tension she'd carried for so long that she'd forgotten it was possible to exist without it. "Thank you," she said. Jack nodded once and continued his patient work with the knife. Spring arrived in the mountains like a careful negotiation between winter and hope. Maybelle had been living in Jack's cabin for 3 weeks when she woke one morning to the sound of water running, where there had been only silence before. The creek that wound through the meadow below the cabin had awakened from its frozen sleep, and its voice carried the promise of renewal that she was beginning to feel in her own life. The days had settled into a rhythm that surprised her with its gentle predictability. Jack rose before dawn to tend the horses and check his trap lines, returning as she finished preparing breakfast. They ate together without much conversation, but the silence felt companionable rather than oppressive. After breakfast, Jack would disappear into the mountains on various errands, checking on scattered livestock, maintaining his traps, gathering firewood, while Maybelle tended to the domestic arrangements that kept their small household functioning. She discovered that the cabin, while well-built and thoughtfully designed, had been organized by a man who'd never expected to share it. Jack's belongings were efficiently arranged, but showed no consideration for the different needs a woman might have. Gradually, with his quiet permission, she'd begun making small changes that improved their mutual comfort without disrupting the essential character of the place. The morning she discovered the seed packets, Maybelle felt something shift in her understanding of what her life here might become. She'd been organizing a storage box when her fingers encountered a collection of small paper envelopes, each carefully labeled in Jack's precise handwriting: beans, squash, corn, carrots, onions, a dozen varieties of vegetables, all selected for their ability to thrive in the short growing season and challenging conditions of the high country. "Found my garden supplies," Jack said from the doorway. Though his tone suggested he'd expected her to discover them eventually. "You garden?" "Some. Never saw much point in hauling vegetables up from town when the ground here will grow them. Just fine if you know what you're doing." He moved to the window that looked out over the meadow where patches of earth were becoming visible as the snow continued its retreat. "Ground should be workable in another week or two." "You interested in putting in a garden this year?" The question was casual, but Maybelle sensed deeper implications in it. A garden was a commitment to place and future, a declaration that this arrangement between them was intended to last beyond the immediate convenience of the moment. "I'd like that," she said. Over the following days, as the weather warmed and the snow retreated further, Jack began teaching her about the rhythms and requirements of mountain agriculture. The growing season was short but intense, he explained, with conditions that could change rapidly and dramatically. Success required careful timing, appropriate plant selection, and a willingness to work with, rather than against, the natural patterns of the high country. "Soil's good here," he said as they walked through the area he'd marked for the garden. "Creek keeps it watered, and the trees break the worst of the wind. Main thing is not being too eager. Plant too early and a late freeze will kill everything. Plant too late and the first snow gets it." Maybelle found herself absorbing this knowledge with an eagerness that surprised her. She'd never had responsibility for anything that lived and grew, never been trusted to nurture something from seed to harvest. The prospect of having a garden, her garden, felt like a gift she'd never thought to ask for. They worked together, preparing the ground, breaking up soil that had been undisturbed for a year, clearing rocks and debris, marking rows with stakes and string. Jack worked with the patient efficiency she was coming to recognize as characteristic of everything he did, while Maybelle discovered muscles she'd forgotten she had and found satisfaction in the honest fatigue that came from productive physical labor. "You ever grown anything before?" Jack asked as they took a break from turning the soil. "Some herbs on the windowsill." "Nothing like this. It's not complicated, but it's not forgiving either. Plants need what they need when they need it. Can't argue with them or convince them to wait." There was something in the way he said it that suggested he was talking about more than agriculture, though Maybelle couldn't quite identify what deeper lesson he might be offering. The afternoon, they finished preparing the garden beds. Jack disappeared into the cabin and returned with something wrapped in oiled cloth. He unwrapped it carefully to reveal a hand tool. Unlike anything Maybelle had seen before, a small hoe, with a blade that had been shaped and sharpened until it was perfectly suited for precise work among growing plants. "Made this last winter," he said, offering it to her. "Figured if we were going to have a proper garden, we ought to have proper tools." The handle had been smoothed and shaped to fit a woman's hands, and the weight was perfectly balanced for controlled work in tight spaces. It was clearly the product of many hours of careful craftsmanship, created by someone who understood both the requirements of gardening and the importance of having tools that felt right in the user's hands. "It's beautiful," Maybelle said, turning the tool over in her hands and appreciating the careful attention to every detail. Tools ought to be pleasant to use. No point in making work harder than it has to be. That evening, as Maybelle sat by the fire with one of Jack's books, she found her attention wandering from the printed page to the events of the day. The garden project had given her something she'd never experienced before, a sense of ownership and responsibility that went beyond mere survival. The seeds they would plant would grow because of her care and attention. The vegetables they would harvest would nourish them through the coming winter because of work she was doing now. For the first time in her adult life, she was creating something rather than simply maintaining or enduring. The feeling was so foreign that she almost didn't recognize it as happiness. Jack sat in his usual chair, working a piece of pine with his whittling knife, creating something that might become a spoon or a handle or simply a smooth, pleasing shape that served no purpose beyond its own existence. The quiet sound of blade on wood was becoming as familiar and comforting as the crackling of the fire. "Jack," she said. He looked up from his work. "Thank you. For the garden, for the tool, for—" She gestured around the cabin, trying to encompass all the ways her life had changed in just a few weeks. "Don't need to thank me. You pull your weight around here." But that wasn't quite what she'd meant, and she suspected he knew it. She was trying to thank him for seeing her as someone capable of growth and contribution, someone worth investing time and effort in creating tools for, someone whose happiness might matter. "Still," she said. Jack nodded and returned to his whittling, but she thought she saw the hint of a smile at the corners of his mouth. Summer settled over the mountain with the quiet intensity of a promise being kept. The garden, that had started as carefully measured rows and tentative green shoots, had transformed into something that exceeded Maybelle's most optimistic expectations. Bean plants climbed the poles Jack had set for them with vigorous enthusiasm, while squash vines spread across the ground in green abundance. The corn stood tall and straight, its silk beginning to brown in the July heat, and the root vegetables showed their progress through increasingly robust foliage. Maybelle had taken to spending the early morning hours in the garden, working among the plants before the day grew too warm. There was something deeply satisfying about the predictable needs of growing things. Water when the soil was dry, cultivation when weeds appeared, gentle support when heavy fruit threatened to break laden branches. The plants responded to her care with a generosity that amazed her, producing far more food than she'd imagined possible from such a small plot. She'd also begun gathering wildflowers during her morning walks, pressing them between the pages of Jack's books with his amused permission. The pressed flowers were becoming a kind of journal of the mountain seasons, a record of what bloomed when and where. Each specimen told a story of discovery: the hidden meadow where Indian paintbrush grew in scarlet profusion, the shaded creek bank where columbines nodded in blue and white clusters, the sunny slope where lupine stretched purple spires toward the sky. "You're making a study of the place," Jack observed one evening as she carefully arranged a collection of mountain asters between sheets of paper. "I want to remember it all," she said. "Everything here is so beautiful, and I never want to forget what it looks like." Jack watched her work with an expression she was learning to recognize, a quiet appreciation for the way she found wonder in things he'd grown accustomed to seeing without really noticing. Her enthusiasm for the mountain's seasonal displays was gradually teaching him to see his surroundings through fresh eyes. The deeper summer brought challenges along with its abundance. Mountain lions had been seen in the area, drawn by the deer that came to drink at the creek below the cabin. Jack increased his vigilance during these weeks, carrying his rifle when he worked outside and instructing Maybelle on safety procedures that might keep her alive if she encountered one of the big cats while he was away. "Don't run," he told her seriously. "Face it, make yourself look large, back away slowly. Most times they're not interested in people, but you never can tell what might make one decide to take a chance." The knowledge that such predators shared their mountain was sobering, but Maybelle found that it didn't frighten her as much as she might have expected. Life in the mountains had taught her that danger was simply another element to be aware of and prepared for, like weather or seasonal change. The key was respect rather than fear, understanding what you were dealing with and taking appropriate precautions. Jack's protectiveness during this period was gentle but unmistakable. He arranged his work to stay closer to the cabin, checked on her more frequently when his duties took him away, and took special care to secure their food stores against wildlife intrusion. It was the kind of practical consideration that characterized all his care for her: thoughtful without being smothering, protective without being controlling. Their conversations had grown longer and more personal as the weeks passed. Jack began sharing stories of his previous life, fragments of military service, mentions of places he'd seen and people he'd known before choosing mountain solitude. He'd been a cavalry scout, Maybelle learned, with experience tracking through country that most people found impassable. The skills that made him an effective mountain man had been learned in service to causes he no longer felt comfortable discussing. "War changes a man," he said one evening as they sat on the cabin porch, watching the sun set over the western peaks. "Some changes are good, some aren't. Takes time to sort out which is which." Maybelle found herself sharing her own memories in return, not the painful ones of her father's cruelty, but the gentler recollections of her mother that she'd kept locked away for years. Stories Dr. Morrison had told her about the woman who died bringing her into the world. Fragments of songs she thought she remembered from earliest childhood. The conviction that her mother would have loved her if she'd lived to know her. "She would have," Jack said with quiet certainty. "Any woman who could raise a daughter like you would have loved you fierce and proud." The words hit Maybelle with unexpected force. No one had ever suggested that she might be the kind of person who deserved fierce, proud love. The possibility that her mother might have looked at her with something other than disappointment was so foreign that she almost couldn't accept it. "You don't know that," she said. "I know you. Anyone who knows you would love you." The statement was delivered with Jack's characteristic directness, as if he were commenting on the weather or the growth rate of the corn. But Maybelle heard something beneath the casual tone that made her heart race in ways she didn't quite know how to interpret. Their first real physical contact came on a hot afternoon when she stumbled while carrying water to the garden. Jack caught her before she could fall, his strong hands steadying her as the water bucket clattered to the ground between them. For a moment they stood frozen, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his body and see the precise color of his gray eyes. "Careful," he said softly, but he didn't immediately release her. Maybelle found herself looking at his face with new attention, the weathered skin that spoke of years spent outdoors. The careful line of his mouth, the way his eyes seemed to hold depths she was only beginning to explore. She'd thought of him as kind and protective, as a man who'd given her refuge when she needed it most. But standing in his arms in the mountain sunlight, she began to wonder if what was growing between them might be something more than mutual convenience. "Maybelle," he said, and her name in his voice sounded different than it ever had before. Then, as if suddenly remembering themselves, they stepped apart. Jack retrieved the fallen bucket while Maybelle smoothed her skirts and tried to regain her composure. But something had shifted between them in those few moments of closeness, something that neither of them was quite ready to acknowledge, but that changed the texture of every interaction that followed. That night, as she lay in her small room, listening to the familiar sounds of Jack moving around the cabin, Maybelle pressed her face into her pillow and wondered what it might mean to be loved fiercely and proudly by someone who already knew all her flaws and limitations and had chosen to value her anyway. The first sign of trouble came on a crisp September morning when Jack returned from checking his trap lines with news that riders had been seen in the lower valley. 3 men in city clothes, he reported, asking questions about land ownership and making notes on surveying equipment that suggested official business rather than casual travel. "Probably nothing to concern us," Jack said as he cleaned his rifle with the methodical attention he brought to all practical tasks. "But worth keeping an eye on." Maybelle felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. Her father's face flashed through her mind, that expression of calculating desperation she'd seen so often during his worst gambling periods. She'd assumed that selling her and the land had resolved his immediate problems. But Sheriff Clay Wallace had never been a man to accept solutions that didn't benefit him in the long term. The riders appeared at their cabin 2 days later, arriving just as Maybelle was harvesting the last of the summer squash. She heard voices from the front of the cabin and walked around to find Jack, standing on the porch with 3 men who looked exactly as out of place in the mountain setting as their city clothes suggested they would be. The man doing the talking was tall and well-fed, with the kind of pale complexion that spoke of spending most of his time indoors. He wore a suit that probably cost more than most Cedar Ridge residents saw in cash during an entire year, and he carried himself with the authority of someone accustomed to having his words carry weight. "Mr. Brennan," he was saying as Maybelle approached, "I'm Robert Kellner, representing the Central Colorado Railroad Company. These gentlemen are my associates, Mr. Harrison and Mr. Mills." Jack's posture had shifted into the alert stillness that Maybelle was learning to recognize as his response to potential threat. "Railroad business up here?" "Indeed it is. We're conducting final surveys for a spur line that will connect the mining camps in the high country with our main line down in the valley. Quite an ambitious project, but one that promises substantial benefits for everyone involved." Kellner reached into his coat and withdrew a rolled document that he spread across the porch railing. "This is our preliminary survey map showing the proposed route for the new line. As you can see, the most practical path runs directly through this valley." Maybelle moved closer to examine the map, her heart sinking as she recognized the landmarks depicted there. The surveyor's marks showed a route that passed within a few hundred yards of their cabin, following the creek valley that provided the most level ground for miles in any direction. "Interesting," Jack said, his voice revealing nothing of whatever thoughts might be running through his mind. "What's that got to do with me?" Kellner smiled with the practiced warmth of a man who made his living convincing people to agree to things they might not initially find appealing. "Well, Mr. Brennan, it appears that you own the land we need for our right-of-way, which puts you in a very fortunate position indeed." He reached into his coat again and produced a second document. "We are prepared to offer you $12,000 for a permanent easement across your property. That's more money than most people in this part of the territory see in a lifetime." The figure hit Maybelle like a physical blow. $12,000. It was a fortune beyond anything she'd ever imagined, enough money to transform them from subsistence mountain dwellers into people of genuine comfort and security. It was also a sum that made Sheriff Clay Wallace's $300 asking price look like the desperate bargain it had been. Jack studied the offered document without taking it. Awful generous for worthless mountain land. Oh, but it's not worthless at all, Mr. Brennan. Quite the contrary. The mineral surveys we've conducted suggest significant silver deposits in the high country, and our railroad will make it economically feasible to extract and transport those resources. Your property sits at the most practical access point to what could become some of the richest mining claims in Colorado. Maybelle felt the ground shifting beneath her feet in ways that had nothing to do with mountain geology. The land that her father had bundled with her as a worthless burden was apparently worth enough to make them wealthy. The realization carried implications that she was only beginning to process. "We'll need some time to consider your offer," Jack said. Kellner's smile became more pointed. "Of course. Though I should mention that we do have some concerns about the legitimacy of your title to this property. Sheriff Wallace down in Cedar Ridge has approached us with claims that the original transaction was conducted under questionable circumstances." The words fell into the mountain air like stones into still water, sending ripples of implication in all directions. Maybelle felt her stomach clench as she realized what her father was attempting. Having discovered the true value of what he'd sold, he was now trying to reclaim it through legal challenges to their marriage. "What kind of concerns?" Jack asked, his voice carrying a new edge that made all three railroad men shift uncomfortably. "Questions about the validity of your marriage, primarily. Sheriff Wallace claims his daughter was coerced into the arrangement, that she was not of sound mind when she consented to the ceremony. If that were proven true, it would invalidate the marriage and, consequently, any transfer of property rights." Maybelle found her voice. "That's a lie." Kellner turned his attention to her with the kind of polite skepticism that suggested he'd already formed his opinions about her intelligence and credibility. "Mrs. Brennan, I'm sure you believe that to be true, but legal determinations of mental competency can be quite complex, particularly when substantial property values are involved. Are you threatening us?" Jack asked, his hand moving almost imperceptibly closer to the rifle that leaned against the cabin wall. "Not at all. We're simply trying to resolve any potential complications before they become expensive legal proceedings. Sheriff Wallace has indicated he would be willing to drop his challenge to your marriage if you were to sell the property to the railroad and split the proceeds with him according to what he considers a more equitable arrangement." The scope of her father's greed and vindictiveness was breathtaking. Not content with having sold her like livestock, he now wanted to retroactively invalidate that sale in order to claim half the windfall that had resulted from it. The fact that such maneuvering would destroy her marriage and force her to return to the life she'd escaped seemed to be a matter of complete indifference to him. "And if we refuse?" Maybelle asked. Kellner's expression became apologetic in the way that suggested he was about to deliver news he didn't particularly enjoy sharing. "Then I'm afraid you'll find yourselves defending your property rights in court, which can be both expensive and unpredictable. Sheriff Wallace has already filed preliminary papers challenging the marriage, and he's retained counsel from Denver who specialize in property disputes." Jack was studying the railroad man with the kind of intense attention he usually reserved for tracking dangerous wildlife. "Seems like you folks have this all worked out pretty convenient. We're simply trying to find a solution that benefits everyone involved. The railroad gets its right of way, you get compensated for your property, and Sheriff Wallace receives what he considers fair treatment. Everyone wins. Except his daughter gets dragged back to a life she chose to leave behind." Kellner shrugged with practiced indifference. "Family disputes are unfortunate, but they're not really our concern. We're interested in securing the property rights we need to complete our project." After the railroad men left, Jack and Maybelle sat on the cabin porch in silence, watching the shadows lengthen across the valley that might soon be filled with railroad tracks and mining equipment. The garden that had given her such joy throughout the summer looked fragile and temporary in the fading light, as if it might disappear at any moment along with everything else they'd built together. "What do we do?" Maybelle asked finally. Jack was quiet for a long moment, his grey eyes fixed on the distant peaks where the first snow of the season was beginning to dust the highest ridges. "We fight," he said simply. "If you want to fight, I want to fight. It won't be easy. Your father's got lawyers and money behind him now. Who could get ugly?" Maybelle thought about the life she'd lived before Jack Brennan stepped forward at that courthouse auction, about the daily humiliation of existing as Clay Wallace's unwanted burden. Then she looked at the man beside her, at the cabin they'd made into a home, at the garden that represented everything good she'd managed to create from the seeds of an impossible situation. "Let it get ugly," she said. "I'm not going back." Jack reached over and took her hand, his calloused fingers intertwining with hers in a gesture that felt like a promise. "Then we'll see this through together." The railroad survey map crinkled in the evening breeze, its carefully drawn lines representing a future that someone else had planned for their land, their lives, their love. But Maybelle was no longer the broken woman who'd stood on those courthouse steps waiting to be sold to the highest bidder. She was someone who'd learned to tend growing things, someone who'd discovered her own capacity for creating beauty and meaning. She was someone worth fighting for, and she finally had someone willing to do the fighting alongside her. The legal papers arrived 3 days later, delivered by a nervous young clerk who'd made the difficult journey from Cedar Ridge with obvious reluctance. Jack accepted the documents with the same calm demeanor he brought to everything else. But Maybelle could see the tension in his shoulders as he read through the formal language that threatened to unravel everything they'd built together. Sheriff Clay Wallace was challenging the validity of their marriage on multiple grounds: mental incompetence, coercion, and fraud. The documents painted Maybelle as a woman too simple-minded to understand the implications of marriage, too intimidated by her father's authority to make free choices, and too naive to recognize when she was being manipulated by a cunning mountain man who'd somehow learned of the land's true value in advance. "He's claiming I knew about the railroad route before the auction," Jack said, looking up from the papers with something that might have been amusement if the situation hadn't been so serious. "Says I conspired to defraud him by taking advantage of his ignorance. That's impossible." "You had no way of knowing." "Course not. But impossible and provable in court are two different things. Your father's lawyers will argue that a man doesn't live alone in the mountains for 7 years without learning things about land development and resource extraction. They'll say I was in contact with the railroad surveyors, maybe even with mining companies looking to establish claims." Maybelle felt the familiar weight of despair settling over her shoulders. Her father had always been skilled at constructing lies that sounded plausible enough to serve his purposes. And now he had expensive legal help in crafting narratives that could destroy her new life. "What evidence do we have?" Jack was quiet for a moment, considering. "Judge Harrison performed the ceremony. He can testify about your state of mind at the time. Dr. Morrison's known you your whole life. He could speak to your intelligence and judgment. Mrs. Patterson saw the whole transaction. Will that be enough?" "Depends on the judge, depends on the jury if it goes that far. Your father's lawyers will argue that small-town people stick together, that local testimony can't be trusted when there's this much money involved." The next morning brought another visitor, Dr. Morrison, riding up the mountain trail with the careful determination of a man who wasn't accustomed to such strenuous travel, but was motivated by something stronger than physical comfort. He dismounted from his tired horse and accepted Jack's offer of coffee with the grateful air of someone who'd been riding since before. "Dawn, heard about the trouble you folks are facing," he said without preamble. "Wanted you to know you've got support in town." "What kind of support?" Jack asked. Dr. Morrison reached into his medical bag and withdrew a thick envelope. "Statements from people who witnessed the auction, who can testify about Maybelle's state of mind and her father's behavior over the years. Mrs. Patterson organized it. She's Got half the town ready to swear that Clay Wallace has been treating his daughter shamefully for decades. Maybelle felt tears prick at her eyes. She'd lived her entire life believing that the townspeople saw her as her father did, as a burden, a disappointment, someone barely worth noticing. The idea that they'd been paying attention, that they'd formed their own opinions about her worth and her father's cruelty, was almost overwhelming. "There's more," Dr. Morrison continued. Young Tommy Fletcher came forward with information about Sheriff Wallace's gambling debts. "Seems the boy's been running errands for some of the men your father owes money to. And he's heard things that paint a pretty clear picture of just how desperate the situation had become." Jack accepted the envelope and rifled through its contents. Page after page of handwritten statements, each one signed and dated, each one offering a piece of evidence that might help establish the truth of their situation. "This is good," he said. "Real good. But we're still going to need legal representation, and lawyers cost money." "Already taken care of," Dr. Morrison said with satisfaction. "Judge Harrison knows a lawyer up in Denver, Thomas Whitfield, who specializes in property disputes and has a reputation for taking on cases where the wealthy try to steamroll ordinary folks. He's agreed to represent you for a reduced fee, with the rest of his payment deferred until after the case is settled." The kindness of virtual strangers was staggering. People who'd barely spoken to her during 38 years of life in Cedar Ridge were now organizing to defend her right to choose her own future. It was a level of community support she'd never imagined possible. That evening, as Jack sat by the fire reading through the witness statements, Maybelle found herself overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was happening. In less than a week, her quiet mountain life had been transformed into the center of a legal battle that would determine not just her marriage and property rights, but her fundamental right to self-determination. "Jack," she said, "what if we just took their money and left? $12,000. We could go anywhere, start over somewhere else." He looked up from the papers, his gray eyes serious. "Is that what you want?" "I want to be with you. Everything else, the land, the cabin, even the garden, none of it matters if I can't have that." Jack set the statements aside and moved to sit beside her on the small sofa he'd built from pine logs and careful craftsmanship. "Maybelle, if we run now, your father wins. He gets to decide that his greed matters more than your happiness, that his version of who you are matters more than who you've chosen to become. But if we fight and lose, then we lose fighting for something that matters. Together." He reached into his pocket and withdrew something she'd never seen before, a pocket watch with a chain of tarnished gold. The timepiece was old but well-maintained, its face showing the kind of careful attention that spoke of deep, sentimental value. "This belonged to my father," Jack said, opening the watch to reveal an inscription inside the cover. "He wasn't much of a man in most ways. Drank too much, worked too little, left my mother to raise 5 children, mostly on her own. But he told me something once that I've never forgotten." He handed her the watch so she could read the inscription. "Time spent protecting what matters is time well spent." Your mother had that engraved. After he died, turned out he'd been sending most of his wages to his brother's widow and her children back east. We thought he was drinking the money away, but he was keeping quiet about supporting family that had nowhere else to turn. Mother said she wanted to remember the good he did, not just the ways he disappointed her. Jack closed the watch and slipped it back into his pocket. "Point is, some things are worth fighting for, even when the odds aren't good. Especially then." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of horses approaching in the darkness. Jack was on his feet immediately, rifle in hand, while Maybelle moved to extinguish the lamp that made them visible through the windows. "Brennan!" a voice called from the yard. "Come out here. We need to talk." Maybelle recognized the voice with a sinking heart. Sheriff Clay Wallace had come to the mountains, presumably to make one final attempt at negotiating a settlement that would serve his interests. Jack opened the door, but remained on the porch, his rifle held at ready position. "Kinda late for social calls, Sheriff." Clay Wallace sat his horse in the moonlight, flanked by 2 men Maybelle didn't recognize. Her father looked older than she remembered, his face drawn with the kind of haggard exhaustion that suggested his legal maneuvering wasn't bringing him the easy resolution he'd hoped for. "Don't have to be this way," Wallace called out. "Railroad's willing to up their offer to 15,000 if we can settle this quick and quiet. That's enough money to keep us all happy." "Us." Jack's voice carried a dangerous edge. "Far as I know, you already sold your interest in this property." That sale was invalid. Any judge with half a brain can see that my daughter wasn't competent to make such a decision. Look at her, 38 years old, never been married, doesn't know the first thing about men or money or legal contracts. Maybelle felt the old shame trying to reassert itself, the familiar weight of her father's contempt settling over her shoulders like a familiar coat. But something had changed in the months since she'd left Cedar Ridge. She was no longer the broken woman who'd stood on those courthouse steps, accepting whatever fate others chose for her. "I know enough," she called out, stepping into the doorway beside Jack. "I know the difference between a man who sees me as a burden and one who sees me as a partner. I know the difference between being sold and being chosen." Sheriff Wallace's laugh was harsh in the mountain air. "You think this mountain man chose you for anything other than what you could bring him? You think any man would want you for yourself?" "I do." The simple statement, delivered with quiet conviction, seemed to hit her father harder than any elaborate argument might have. For a moment, the confident bluster that had carried him through decades of manipulation and bullying faltered. "You'll regret this," he said finally. "When those lawyers get done with you in court, when everyone hears what a fool you've been, you'll come crawling back. And I might not be feeling generous enough to take you in. Then I'll sleep under the stars," Maybelle replied. "Better to be cold and free than warm and caged." Sheriff Wallace wheeled his horse around and rode back into the darkness, his companions following without comment. Jack stood watching until the sound of hoofbeats faded completely. Then he set his rifle aside and turned to Maybelle with an expression of profound respect. "You ready for this fight?" he asked. "I've been ready my whole life. I just didn't know it until now." The courthouse in Cedar Ridge had never seen a crowd like the one that gathered on the morning of the hearing. Word had spread throughout the territory that a woman's right to choose her own husband was being challenged by her own father, and people had come from as far as 50 miles away to witness the proceedings. The railroad's involvement had attracted additional attention from mining interests and land speculators, all of whom understood that the outcome would set precedents for future property disputes. Maybelle sat beside Thomas Whitfield, the Denver lawyer who'd agreed to represent them, trying to steady her nerves as the courtroom filled with curious onlookers. Whitfield was a small, neat man in his 50s with the kind of precise attention to detail that suggested he was accustomed to winning cases through careful preparation rather than dramatic courtroom theatrics. "Remember," he said quietly, "answer only what's asked. Don't volunteer information, don't let them provoke you into anger, and don't apologize for any of the choices you've made. You have nothing to be ashamed of." Across the aisle, Sheriff Wallace sat with his legal team, 3 expensive lawyers from Denver who looked supremely confident about their chances of success. The lead attorney, a man named Randolph Carver, had a reputation for aggressive tactics and a willingness to destroy witnesses who stood in his way. He'd already made it clear that he intended to paint Maybelle as a woman too simple-minded to understand her own interests, and Jack as a calculating opportunist who'd taken advantage of her limitations. Judge Samuel Garrett called the court to order, with the weary authority of a man who'd spent 30 years settling disputes between people who should have been able to work things out for themselves. He was known for his fairness, but also for his impatience with legal maneuvering that served lawyers' fees more than justice. "This court will determine the validity of the marriage between Jack Brennan and Maybelle Wallace," Judge Garrett announced, "and consequently the legitimacy of any property transfers that resulted from that union. Mr. Carver, you may present your case." Carver rose with theatrical precision, his opening statement designed to establish Maybelle as a victim of manipulation rather than a woman capable of making informed decisions. He painted her father as a concerned parent, trying to protect his daughter from her own poor judgment, while portraying Jack as a cunning schemer who'd somehow learned of the land's value and orchestrated an elaborate fraud. "Ladies and gentlemen," Carver said, addressing the jury with practiced sincerity, "we are here to protect a vulnerable woman from the consequences of decisions she was not competent to make. Maybelle Wallace, a spinster of 38, years with no experience of the world, was manipulated into a marriage that served only her husband's financial interests." The word spinster hit Maybelle like a physical blow, carrying with it all the shame and judgment she'd internalized over the years. But as she looked around the courtroom and saw the faces of people who'd traveled considerable distances to support her, she felt something stronger than shame. She felt the quiet strength that came from being valued by others, from knowing that her choices mattered to people beyond herself. Carver called Sheriff Wallace as his first witness, and Maybelle watched her father take the stand with the confident air of a man who'd spent years manipulating situations to his advantage. Under Carver's careful questioning, Wallace painted himself as a devoted father concerned about his daughter's welfare, forced to take legal action only when it became clear that she'd been victimized by a clever confidence man. "My daughter has always been a simple girl," Wallace testified, his voice carrying just the right note of paternal concern. "Trusting, you might say, not the sort to understand when someone might be taking advantage of her good nature. In your opinion, Sheriff Wallace, was your daughter competent to understand the implications of marriage when she consented to this arrangement?" Wallace shook his head sadly. "She's never shown much judgment about people. Never had a beau, never learned how to tell when a man might be lying to her about his intentions. When this Brennan fellow showed up with his gold coins and his smooth talk, she didn't have the experience to see through his scheme." Thomas Whitfield's cross-examination was surgical in its precision. He led Wallace through a detailed recounting of the auction, forcing him to admit that he'd offered his daughter for sale like livestock, that he'd been drinking heavily that day, and that his primary motivation had been settling gambling debts rather than securing his daughter's happiness. "Sheriff Wallace," Whitfield said, "isn't it true that you publicly announced you were selling your daughter along with worthless land parcels to settle your financial obligations? I was trying to find her a good husband by calling out to a crowd, 'Who wants my fat daughter?' Those were your exact words, weren't they?" Wallace's composure cracked slightly. "I may have used some unfortunate language, and when Mr. Brennan stepped forward, you didn't inquire about his character, his intentions, or his ability to provide for your daughter, did you? You simply asked for money. The transaction was perfectly legal." "I'm not asking about legality, Sheriff. I'm asking about your concern for your daughter's welfare. Did you make any effort to determine whether Mr. Brennan would be a suitable husband?" Wallace's silence spoke louder than any answer he might have given. When court recessed for lunch, Maybelle found herself surrounded by townspeople who'd come to offer their support. Mrs. Patterson pressed a sandwich into her hands, while Dr. Morrison assured her that the truth was becoming clear to anyone paying attention. Even young Tommy Fletcher had traveled from Cedar Ridge to serve as a witness, his earnest face showing the kind of moral certainty that only the young possess when confronting obvious injustice. "You're doing fine," Whitfield told her as they prepared for the afternoon session. "Your father's credibility is crumbling, and the jury can see what kind of man he really is. Now comes the hard part. They're going to try to tear you down personally. Remember what I told you. Answer truthfully, stay calm, and don't let them make you ashamed of who you are." When Carver called Maybelle to the witness stand, she felt the weight of every eye in the courtroom following her movement. This was the moment that would determine whether she would be seen as a competent woman capable of making her own choices, or as the simple-minded burden her father claimed her to be. "Mrs. Brennan," Carver began, his tone suggesting that even her married name was questionable. You lived with your father for 38 years before this alleged marriage. In all that time, did you ever express any desire to marry? I never had the opportunity, Maybelle replied, keeping her voice steady despite the tremor she felt in her chest. The opportunity? Surely a woman who wanted marriage would have found ways to meet eligible men, would have made herself available for courtship. Isn't it true that you simply accepted your unmarried status because you understood your limitations? Thomas Whitfield rose smoothly. Objection. Counsel is asking the witness to speculate about her own motivations based on his characterization of events. Sustained, Judge Garrett said. Rephrase your question, Mr. Carver. Carver adjusted his approach, but continued his attack. Mrs. Brennan, had you ever lived independently before your marriage to Mr. Brennan? No. Had you ever managed your own finances, made significant purchases, or conducted business transactions of any kind? No, but thank you. Had you ever been courted by a man, kissed, or engaged in any romantic relationship prior to meeting Mr. Brennan? The personal nature of the question brought heat to Maybelle's cheeks, but she forced herself to answer clearly. No. So when this strange man appeared at a public auction and offered to purchase you along with some worthless land, you had no experience whatsoever to help you evaluate his character or intentions. I had 38 years of experience evaluating my father's character, Maybelle said, her voice carrying an edge that surprised even her. That taught me the difference between a man who sees women as property and one who sees them as people. A murmur ran through the courtroom, and Carver's confident expression flickered slightly. He'd expected a timid woman who could be easily intimidated, not someone willing to turn his questions back on him. You claim to have fallen in love with Mr. Brennan, Carver continued. How long did this great romance take to develop? A day? A week? Love isn't something that happens on a schedule, Mr. Carver. It grows when two people treat each other with respect and kindness. Respect and kindness from a man who purchased you like livestock? Respect and kindness from a man who saw me as worth protecting when my own father saw me as worth selling. The courtroom fell completely silent. Even Judge Garrett leaned forward slightly, recognizing that something significant was happening at the witness stand. Carver pressed on, but his questions were increasingly met with answers that demonstrated not simple-mindedness, but a clear understanding of her circumstances and choices. When he tried to suggest that Jack had somehow tricked her into marriage, Maybelle calmly explained the consideration he'd shown for her comfort and safety. When he implied that she was too naive to understand property values, she detailed the improvements they'd made to the land and her understanding of their financial situation. One final question. Mrs. Brennan, Carver said, his frustration beginning to show, if you could go back to that day at the courthouse, knowing what you know now about the value of this land, would you make the same choice? Maybelle looked across the courtroom to where Jack sat, his grey eyes steady and encouraging. Then she looked at her father, who was watching her with the calculating expression she remembered from childhood. Finally, she turned back to face the jury. Mr. Carver, if I could go back to that day, I would make the same choice even if the land was truly worthless. I would choose a man who sees me as a partner over a father who sees me as a burden. I would choose kindness over cruelty, respect over contempt, and hope over despair. The value of the land doesn't change the value of the choice. When Thomas Whitfield rose for his cross-examination, he needed only a few questions to establish what the jury had already seen, that Maybelle was not only competent but possessed a clarity of judgment that had been absent from her father's. Testimony, Mrs. Brennan, Whitfield said. In your months of marriage to Mr. Brennan, has he ever given you reason to doubt his character or his commitment to your welfare? Never. He has shown me nothing but kindness and respect. And in 38 years of living with your father, how often did he show you that same kindness and respect? Carver objected, but Judge Garrett allowed the question. Never, Maybelle said quietly. Not once. Dr. Morrison's testimony about Maybelle's intelligence and judgment, Mrs. Patterson's account of the auction, and Tommy Fletcher's earnest description of Sheriff Wallace's gambling debts all served to reinforce what had already become clear. The final blow came when Judge Harrison took the stand and described Wallace's behavior on the day of the wedding. His eagerness to complete the transaction, his obvious relief at settling his debts, and his complete lack of concern for his daughter's feelings about the arrangement. When Sheriff Wallace was recalled for further questioning, Whitfield produced documentation of the gambling debts that had motivated the auction, forcing Wallace to admit that his primary concern had been his own financial survival rather than his daughter's welfare. The jury deliberated for less than an hour. When they returned, their foreman stood to deliver a verdict that would echo through the territory for years to come. We find that the marriage between Jack Brennan and Maybelle Wallace was entered into freely and legally, with full consent and understanding by both parties. Sheriff Wallace's challenge to this marriage is without merit. As the gavel fell, Maybelle felt a weight she'd carried her entire life finally lift from her shoulders. She was free to be the woman she'd chosen to become, married to the man she'd chosen to love, living the life they'd built together on land that now legally belonged to them both. 1 year later, Maybelle stood in the garden that had become the heart of her mountain home, her hands resting on the gentle swell of her belly as she watched Jack split wood for the coming winter. The morning air carried the crisp promise of autumn, and the mountains around them blazed with the gold and scarlet that marked the turning of another season. The railroad had come and gone through their valley, leaving behind a modest spur line that connected the high-country mining camps to the main route below. Jack had negotiated a fair price for the right-of-way, enough to ensure their financial security without forcing them to change the essential character of their life together. The money sat in the bank in Cedar Ridge, a comfortable cushion that allowed them to make improvements to their property and plan for the future without the constant pressure of mere survival. Sheriff Clay Wallace had left the territory entirely after the trial, his reputation destroyed, and his creditors no longer willing to extend the patience that his badge had once commanded. Dr. Morrison had written to tell them that Wallace had been seen in a mining camp near Leadville, working as a common laborer and keeping to himself. Maybelle felt no vindication in his downfall, only a quiet sadness for the man who'd chosen bitterness over love and lost everything that might have mattered. The baby was due in early spring, and Dr. Morrison had already promised to make the journey up the mountain when the time came. Unlike her mother, Maybelle faced the prospect of childbirth without fear. She'd learned what it felt like to be cherished, to have someone who would move mountains to protect her welfare. Jack had already begun preparing a cradle from mountain pine, his hands shaping the wood with the same patient care he brought to everything he loved. "Feeling all right?" he asked, setting down his axe and walking over to where she stood among the frost-touched remains of their summer garden. "Perfect," she said, and meant it completely. Their relationship had deepened through the months following the trial, growing from mutual respect and gratitude into something that felt as natural and essential as breathing. The physical intimacy that had developed between them was tender and profound, built on a foundation of trust that made every touch feel like a gift freely given and gratefully received. Jack reached into his pocket and withdrew a simple band carved from mountain oak, its surface polished to a warm glow that caught the morning light. "Been working on this," he said, taking her left hand and slipping the wooden ring onto her finger beside the legal gold band they'd purchased in town. "Figured you ought to have something made from this place. From what we've built together." Maybelle looked down at the ring he'd crafted with his own hands, seeing in its simple beauty all the love and commitment that had grown between them in this mountain sanctuary. It was more precious than any jewel because it represented the life they'd chosen to create together, carved from the raw material of unexpected love and polished by daily acts of kindness and respect. "It's perfect," she whispered, tears blurring her vision as she looked up at the man who'd given her not just refuge, but the chance to discover who she really was. Their quiet moment was interrupted by the sound of horses approaching, and they turned to see Mrs. Patterson leading a small procession up the mountain trail. Behind her rode Dr. Morrison, Tommy Fletcher, now grown tall and serious at 15, and several other townspeople who'd become friends during the difficult months of the legal proceedings. "Thought we'd bring you some supplies before the heavy snow set in," Mrs. Patterson called out as she dismounted with the efficiency of someone who'd spent her life managing practical difficulties. "And we wanted to see how you were getting along." The visitors brought news from Cedar Ridge and beyond, marriages and births, business ventures and seasonal concerns that connected Maybelle and Jack to the wider world they'd chosen to live apart from. But more than news, they brought the warmth of community acceptance, the knowledge that their love story had inspired others to believe in the possibility of second chances and unexpected happiness. As the afternoon progressed and their guests prepared to return to town before darkness fell, Dr. Morrison pulled Maybelle aside for a private word. "Your mother would be proud of you," he said simply. "She wanted nothing more than for you to find your own way in the world, to be valued for who you are rather than tolerated for who others thought you should be." "You think she would have approved of Jack?" Dr. Morrison smiled, his eyes twinkling with memories of the woman who died bringing Maybelle into the world. "She would have loved him for loving you the way you deserve to be loved. That's all any mother wants for her daughter." After their visitors had gone, Jack and Maybelle sat on their porch watching the sunset over the western peaks. The same view that had greeted them every evening for more than a year, but which never lost its power to inspire wonder. The baby moved restlessly in Maybelle's womb, as if eager to join them in this mountain paradise they'd carved from the wilderness of their separate loneliness. "What do you think about when you look out there?" Jack asked, following her gaze toward the distant summits that caught the last light of day. "I think about how some wounds do heal," Maybelle said, her hand moving unconsciously to the wooden ring he'd placed on her finger. "Especially when they're tended by the right person with enough patience and love." Jack reached over and took her hand, his calloused fingers intertwining with hers in the gesture that had become as natural as breathing. "What else?" "I think about how the most worthless things can sometimes turn out to be the most precious. A broken woman, a mountain man who chose solitude, a piece of land that nobody wanted, and look what we made from it all." As the stars began to appear in the clear mountain air, Maybelle felt the deep contentment that comes from being exactly where you belong, with exactly the right person. She'd learned that love could transform even the deepest pain, that kindness could heal wounds that seemed permanent, and that sometimes the most important journey is the one that takes you home to yourself. The mountain wind carried the scent of pine and coming snow, promising another winter of quiet evenings by the fire, of stories shared and dreams planned, of love that had grown strong enough to weather any storm. In the distance, a coyote called to its mate, and the sound seemed to echo the truth that Maybelle had discovered in this wild, beautiful place, that some bonds once formed can never be broken.